The developments in Syria have made Erdogan the winner. But the battle for primacy in the Middle East always used to be between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now with Turkey throwing its hat in the ring. So how do you assess all these developments?
Okay, so first of all, it has to be said that the regional geopolitical history of confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, first of all, really seems to have cooled down in the last year, 2 years. In Chinese brokered discussion, Erdogan regards the Kurds. He regards them as terrorists. He doesn't regard Al Qaeda and ISIS as terrorists. Let's make that clear. He is, he's pragmatic. He's cunning, a cunning, treacherous beast, but he is also an Islamist. And basically, evidently, the Syrian government Assad was told, if you stay out of this conflict between Israel and Iran and distance yourself from Iran, we won't touch you.
Hello everyone. Today I'm excited to welcome back Mr. Mark Sleboda. His presence last time really boosted my channel, and boosted would be an understatement. So, Mr. Sleboda, once again, thank you for your time and a warm welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
So, I would like to start by talking about the recent developments in the Middle East. So, the developments in Syria have made Erdogan the winner, but the battle for primacy in the Middle East always used to be between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, with Turkey throwing its hat in the ring. So, how do you assess all these developments?
Okay, so first of all, it has to be said that the regional geopolitical history of confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, first of all, really seems to have cooled down in the last year, 2 years. In Chinese brokered discussions, Iran and Saudi Arabia restored relations with each other, restored diplomatic relations. There's a normalization, and everything we've seen since has been not to exaggerate it, not to say that there's no tensions or no possibility of the restoration of tensions, but in the months since, we have not seen that. What we've seen is a slow, continued improvement of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So if there is a regional confrontation in the Middle East now, in the aftermath of the collapse of Syria, then it is most definitely between the U.S. and Iran, the U.S. and Israel on one side, and Iran on the other side. That is the state. Now, certainly Turkey as a third player, now quite obviously with neo-Ottoman pretensions, and a very significant success under their belt of toppling the Assad government in Syria. However, I suspect that everything is not going to be sanguine for Turkey. For one, there is still the problem of the U.S.-backed Kurds. It's the YPG rebranded by the U.S. quite openly as the Syrian Democratic Forces, continue to be camped out, illegally militarily occupying East Syria, in particular Syria's oil fields and wheat fields, which led to the hollowing out of the Syrian economy along with Western sanctions and setting the context for the successful regime change operation in Syria. But quite obviously, Erdogan regards the Kurds, he regards them as terrorists. He doesn't regard Al Qaeda and ISIS as terrorists. Let's make that clear. He is, he's pragmatic. He's cunning, a cunning, treacherous beast, but he is also an Islamist, right? And that's important to keep in mind, Erdogan's worldview. He comes from an Islamist family. and his political party is Islamist. So while he can be pragmatic, there's no question about, and opportunistic. There's no question about that. He is also an Islamist. So quite obviously, he would like to drive the U.S. out of East Syria and to deal with any type of restoration of Kurdish power. He would like the Kurds in East Syria subordinated to theoretically whatever government regime caliphate emerges out of Damascus in the coming weeks and months. I think that itself is going to be problematic, and I expect to see Syria fractured, much like Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall, and no one could ever put the pieces back together again. But let's set the context. Let's take a step back from the current to what happened over the last few weeks and the last couple of months. So Russia intervened in the West and the GCC's jihadi proxy war of regime change on Syria in 2015. By 2019, Russia and the Syrian government had recovered about the majority of Syrian territory, about 2/3 of it, and by far the majority of its population, if not of its natural resources. And there was a management of the Russia and Iran's geopolitical differences with Turkey that was codified as a more or less frozen conflict under the Astana Accords. Now, the U.S. and the Kurds were not a party to the Astana Accords, but they kind of fell into it as well. So that settled a three-way Mexican standoff in Syria in frozen conflict terms, with the Syrian government, the Ba'athist government of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, backed by Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, with the north of Syria to a depth of about 30 kilometers, occupied by the Turks, with a proxy of what had formerly been the Free Syrian Army and Ahrar al-Sham and a number of other Salafist and Islamist militias and groups in Syria that they rebranded as direct proxies under the Syrian National Army. And reportedly, there were some 80 to 100,000 of those. As well as that, northern Idlib remained occupied by the more, shall we say, international and odious jihadists that couldn't as easily be rebranded or absorbed as direct Turkish proxies. This was an area largely governed by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is, a direct, descendant rebranding of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, right? It is Al-Qaeda in Syria. And even the United States admits, one, that they are a terrorist organization, although that may change now as they become geopolitically convenient, and that they are Al-Qaeda. And the leader of these of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Juliani, he was previously a deputy of ISIS. He was the commander of ISIS in Syria, and then he became the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. And along with them, there was sundry other, the other 31 flavors of jihad organizations, many of them international jihad in Idlib. One of the most notorious, perhaps, is the Turkestan Islamic Party, which consists of large numbers of Salafist, formerly Chinese Uyghurs, and Central Asians, and many other smaller organizations. But this frozen conflict set in for a good close to 5 years, and this started to change back in September. Erdogan had pushed for a normalization of relations with Assad on his terms, right? Now, what he really wanted was officiation of his de facto control of northern Syria. He wanted a political process that devolved a degree of autonomy to northern Syria as a kind of Sunni Islamist statelet that would ultimately, while on paper still be part of Syria, in reality owe their loyalty to Erdogan in Ankara, and thus give him a great degree of leverage on Syria moving into the future. There's also still several million refugees from the Syrian conflict in Turkey. Now, these are largely Sunni Islamists. And to be frank, the government in Damascus didn't want them back. To a very large degree, they are the families and relatives, right, of the Islamists and jihadists in the Syrian National Army. But if there's one thing that all of the political factions in Turkey agree on, is that they hated the Syrian refugees and they wanted them gone. They were a big political millstone around Erdogan's neck, right? First of all, there was a cost in supporting them, right? As refugees, they required food and security and all of these other things. But also, when they did work, they drove down wages and they took low wage jobs, right, away from presumably what would be Turks, and lowered the prices because, of course, they were willing to do, when they were willing to do work, they would do it for much less. And they were very active in crime, right? There was a lot of crime going on. So everyone in Turkey wanted them gone, and they had been there for close to a decade, right? So Erdogan wanted to relocate them and essentially recolonize the north of Syria as a firmly, completely Sunni Islamist state. Now, he had already driven out most of the Kurds out of northern Syria, which had been a Kurdish dominant area. They had all been pushed further south or further east into the U.S.-controlled area. That's what he wanted. And Assad was not willing to give him that, right? Previously, Assad and Erdogan had good relations, right? The families, the Assad and the Erdogan family, vacationed together, right? There's lots of pictures of them laughing and, enjoying each other's presence. So he regarded everything that Erdogan did. And it has to be clear that, while the U.S. and the U.K. and France and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, everyone else was involved, ultimately, the Syrian civil, it was framed as a civil war. It was really a jihadi proxy war on Syria to a very large degree. It could not have happened without Turkey, right? It was all, for the most part, it was based out of Turkey, right? And a lot of it was done under Turkey's aegis. The logistics, the money, the organization, this was all done out of Turkey. So it would have been impossible. And he was literally supporting head chopping, suicide bombing Salafists, to kill the Syrian people, right? The Syrian minorities that the government of the Ba'athist government has always, kind of branded itself as protecting the religious ethnic minorities of Syria, the Alawites, the Shia, the Christians, the Druze, the Kurds, etc., against what still was a Sunni majority country, some 60-some percent. However, not all of them were Islamists, right? That is a very, not all Sunnis are Islamists, quite obviously. And of course, most of the Sunnis of Syria, didn't want to live under an Islamist, state, with this, Sharia law and interpretation of what I think is rightly regarded as a twisted interpretation of Islam, but I'm not Islamic, so that's really not for me to say. But there's a reason why they're called takfiris, right? I mean, that's what it is. After the frozen conflict set in place, several things happened. One, Russia, of course, became preoccupied with the conflict in Ukraine. And the Russian military footprint in Syria was drastically reduced down to something like 300 or 400 troops, right? With an air unit, with naval forces there, primarily out of two military bases, the Tartus naval base and the Hmaimim air base, both of which are very close and in the Latakia coastline countryside. The Syrian economy continued to deteriorate. Western sanctions were absolutely crippling, denying access to Syria to any international trade or finance. And the U.S. was sitting on pretty much all of Syria's oil and wheat. So the economy of Syria dropped by like 85%. It was 15% of what it was in 2010. And that's really quite hard, to imagine, of course. The Damascus quite often had 4 hours, the capital city had 4 hours of electricity a day, right? Rationing and malnutrition were a real thing. Now, the salary of a Syrian military officer in the Syrian Arab Army was somewhere between $30 and a max of $50 a month. Meanwhile, one of the jihadis on the Turkish payroll was making $1,500 a month, right? That Turkish payroll partly funded by Qatar still, but anyway. So you can see the Syrian economy and thus the Syrian Arab Army became hollowed out to a pretty much unimaginable degree. The people stopped having hope of a better future. They just lived in misery with no clear sign to the end of it. The U.S. was not going to give up their occupation. They claim, of course, that they're there for combating ISIS, but amazingly enough, the only place in Syria where ISIS still supposedly existed was in the area of U.S. military occupation. They didn't exist in the Syrian government-controlled territory. Even in Idlib, Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they wouldn't put up with any real alternate frameworks or any alternate caliphate, from their own rule there that didn't swear fealty to them. So the only area where supposedly ISIS still existed is the U.S. sector of East Syria, despite all these years of supposedly battling them. Either that's just a lie and a pretext, or the U.S. military is completely incompetent and unable to deal with any type of insurgency. I'll let you, draw your own interpretation from that. But you think they might have noticed that the Syrian government just fell to a former leader of ISIS in Syria. They're there. We're going to stay here in Syria, even though the Assad government is gone, because ISIS might be resurgent. Yeah, they're resurgent. They just took over Damascus, right? So it's obscene, pretty much obscene justification of the U.S. occupation of East Syria. They were quite clear. We had State Department officials make clear that, denying Syria the oil and the wheat that they needed to stabilize their economy and much less restore it. They were there to achieve regime change by other means. If the jihadi proxy war initially failed, well, then they would strangle and starve the Syrian economy into submission. And that set the context for what was going to happen. In September, there started to be public word that in particular, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was rearming and organizing in a big way for a new offensive, right? Breaking the so-called Astana Accords, right? By the Astana Accords, Erdogan was supposed to separate the terrorists of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other groups from the quote-unquote legitimate Islamist opposition and then deal with the terrorists. Of course, Erdogan doesn't regard these people as terrorists. When Erdogan says terrorists, what he means is the Kurds, right? When Russia and the Syrian government said terrorists, they meant Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other 31 flavors of jihad. So Erdogan never fulfilled the Astana Accords. You can place some degree of blame all the way around, but if you don't deal with the terrorists, then how separate them from the quote-unquote legitimate opposition? How can you have political dialogue with the legitimate opposition, right? That's the government, the argument that the Syrian government made. So Assad refused to meet with Erdogan until they stopped supporting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and until Turkish military forces withdrew from northern Syria. Well, Erdogan got really piqued at this because he had the political problem of the refugees and he wanted some this is what he wanted out of Astana. He wanted officiation of his de facto control of northern Syria and thus leverage within Syria itself. And when he made clear that he wasn't going to get it, he put in place plans to overthrow the government in Syria using these same jihadists. Now, I'm sure it wasn't just him. I'm sure that U.S. intelligence was involved, British intelligence, French intelligence, and almost certainly Israel as well, to a significant degree. But 90% of it is still Erdogan, right? So the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, quote unquote, this Islamist propaganda outfit in London, began saying that they were preparing for an offensive in September. In October, mid-October, Russia restarted major airstrikes in Idlib. They saw what was going on and they started taking action. Now, they had a reduced air contingent in Syria. But what they had was working overtime. Airstrikes, helicopter gunships, drone strikes. It was going on from the middle of October. And Iran started warning Assad as well, right? They had a reduced contingent in Syria too, because Assad was being quietly, through backdoor channels, courted by the West. And basically, evidently, the Syrian government Assad was told, if you stay out of this conflict between Israel and Iran and distance yourself from Iran, we won't touch you. So that's what he did. And the number of Iranian advisors and Iraqi popular mobilization units, with the Shiites with Iranian backing, were reduced down to just about nothing. Right, in Syria. So still, Iran was warning, look at, they're building up. Do you want us back in? Do you want us to help? And nothing from Damascus. And I maybe they believed the West. Maybe Assad believed the West that he would remain untouched. I don't know. I don't know what was going on there. But what became obvious in the middle of November, Al Jazeera started reporting on the looming offensive as well. And then, less than 2 weeks later, the end of November, it kicked off. It appears the Syrian army had done nothing to prepare. In fact, they had moved many of their best forces to the south of Syria inexplicably. Hezbollah had moved most of their forces out of the country to deal with the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon. So it was kind of a perfect storm where all of Syria's allies were at minimum presence within the country. And now it's obvious that there was a major subversion and co-option campaign by some combination of Western and Turkish intelligence, right, against the generals and officers of the Syrian Army, and a lot of figures within the civil political administration, clan leaders, and the like in Syria. This must have been massive, right? Buying them out, bribing them, blackmail, threats, whatever it took, to get them under the thumb. So when the time came, they retreated, or actively just stood down there and dispersed their troops. And that's exactly what happened.